Good evening, everyone. This is a regular meeting of the Guam Public Utilities Commission. It's June 26, 2025, 6:35 p.m. All commissioners are present. And first order of business is approval of the minutes of the May 29th, 2025 regular meeting. Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve, subject to corrections.
Thank you, Pete. Second? Joe seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Passes unanimously. First item up tonight is GWA docket number 2508, petition to approve the issuance and sale of the Guam Waterworks Authority Water and Wastewater Series 2025A revenue bonds. We have an ALJ report and a proposed order. Mr. Director.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. GWA is a client of our law firm in pending litigation, so I'm not able to participate in this matter.
Thank you, Mr. Pangilinan. You are recused from this matter. Go ahead, Fred.
All right. Good evening, Chairman, Commissioners. This matter comes before the PUC pursuant to GWA's petition to approve the issuance and sale of the Guam Waterworks Authority Water and Wastewater Series 2025A revenue bonds filed by GWA on June 6, 2025. In the instant petition, GWA seeks to issue and sell up to $350 million in water and wastewater system revenue bonds as authorized by Public Law 37103. In GWA docket 2405 in September 2024, the PUC did issue a rate decision which approved a 5-year capital investment program estimated at a cost of $899 million. GWA submits that the $350 million amount is within GWA's current financing plan and rate structure as approved by the PUC in the 2024 to 2029 5-year plan, which will cover both interest and principal payments on the borrowing once they begin. Under the bond structure, the principal on the bonds will not come due within the first 5 years from the date of issuance. GWA states that no new rate increases will be required to support the issuance under GWA's present 5-year rate plan ending in FY 2029. Now, of course, since this is bond funds, the PUC must approve the bond issuance and any expenditure of the bond funds under the contract review protocol. GWA filed its June 6 petition. It submitted that the proceeds from the bond issuance will fund critical infrastructure projects necessary to construct, improve, maintain, and repair GWA's water and wastewater systems, and that these investments will also support the planned and required additions, upgrades, and treatment systems mandated by court orders, federal regulations, and local environmental laws. Now, the actual amount of the bond proceeds sought from the issuance may be in the range of $274,947,000. I'll explain that difference subsequently. The final par amount for the bonds, according to GWA, may increase, though, if market interest rates move unfavorably, and specifically if basis points between 25 and 100 basis points shift against GWA. GWA Resolution 27 FY 2025 issued by the Guam Consolidated Commission on Utilities. Pursuant to that resolution, the CCU authorized the issuance of one or more series of additional bonds in an aggregate principal not to exceed $350 million to finance various projects, to pay the cost of issuance of the bonds, for credit enhancement, and to fund a deposit to a debt service reserve fund. The CCU indicates that the issuance of the bonds is necessary to provide improvements to the system. It was Public Law 37103 that authorized the bond issuance, and in that law, the legislature expressly approved GWA's issuance and sale of revenue bonds having a principal amount not to exceed $560 million. Regarding the purposes for the issuance of the bonds, the legislature stated as follows. In addition, such bonds shall be issued for the purpose of financing capital improvement projects necessary for compliance with regulatory enforcement actions, including any consent decree entered into between the authority and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and U.S. Department of Justice. Financing capital improvement projects referenced in the authority's 20-year master plan and 5-year revenue plan. And also for funding a reserve fund deposit with reserve to the bonds, and for paying expenses related to the authorization, sale, and issuance of new bonds. The legislature mentioned capitalized interest, but actually there is no capitalized interest in these bonds. There is a provision that interest payments will not be made for 5 years in the bonds. Yes, interest only for 5 years. Yes, yeah. Principal still. Well, I raised that question too, and I'll explain what responses were given to me. I wondered about that. In the section 1 of the legislature did recognize the current GWA 5-year financial plan, including the $898 million investment in GWA Capital Investment Program, of which $780 million will need to be borrowed. So this is really the mover, the impetus for this bond issuance. It's to pay at least a portion, and I think the bond fund here actually will be $250 million. So it's not going to pay for the entire program over the 5 years, but it's mostly to pay for those capital improvement projects. We always assess at the PUC whether there was Guam Economic Development Authority approval, and there was. On June 19th, the Board of Directors of GEDA enacted Resolution 2509, which authorized the issuance and sale of the wastewater revenue bonds, water and wastewater bonds, in the amount not to exceed $350 million. Also, you'll see, I did request that Georgetown Consulting Group assess the bond issuance, and they filed their report dated June 14th. They concluded that the bond should be approved, the petition of GWA should be approved, the petition is compliant with enabling legislation and aligned with previously approved financial planning. The proposed bond issuance serves critical infrastructure and regulatory compliance needs. Now, as I had indicated, the bond itself, when we look at some of the financial documents from the underwriters, it indicated there a bond principal amount of $268,185,000 and a bond premium of $6,792,000. $6,762,000. So again, it's about $274 million is at least in terms of what they're specifying. As I mentioned, it could be more. The all-in total interest cost calculation was 5.14%. The amount of $250 million would be placed in the project fund, and an amount of $19.6 million in the debt service reserve fund. Over the average life of the bonds of 20.6 years, GWA and the ratepayers will pay debt service of $554.9 million, with an average annual debt service of $18.5 million. So I found that the bond issuance is justified, and I covered that in some detail in my report. The preliminary official statement and the Ghilardi-Rothstein study that was submitted with the petition indicate various reasons for the bond issuance. GWA has demonstrated the necessity for seeking the bond issuance to provide adequate funding for its CIP project for years FY 2025 to 2029. And I just wanted to go over those briefly, the amounts of the spending. So from the preliminary official statement, approximately $356.4 million, or 39.7% of the 2025-2029 CIP is allocated to projects to comply with the 2011 court order and the 2024 partial consent decree. And under the partial consent decree, there are a lot of wastewater projects involving the gravity mains, the force mains, pumping stations. There are improvements that the federal government is requiring GWA to undertake. In addition, we have approximately $203.1 million, or 22.6% of the 2025-2029 CIP for water loss control projects. Now, you'll remember those. We have the district metered areas where GWA is attempting to measure water loss and take steps to improve water loss through building new water lines, et cetera. So that's something the PUC has been concerned about for many years, with a possible loss of 50 to 60% of the water as non-revenue sources. So there's a large expenditure for that. And also PFAS and other contaminants like dieldrin. There is $204.7 million, or 22.8%. Now I want to make it clear, that's for the entire 5 years. That's not all to be funded by this bond issuance. But I also attached to my report a listing of the 2025 to 2026 capital projects. That was it's Exhibit A to the order approving long-term debt. But there, GWA has set out the specific projects: water production, water treatment, distribution, piping, wastewater collection. Again, a lot of the wastewater part is related to the PFAS, and not PFAS, but to correcting the issues in the consent decree. So you can look over that exhibit if you wish to see them. But that's kind of a summary of what the projects are. Now, as far as issues regarding the bonds, of course, when I reviewed through this, I tried to think of, what are the possible issues? And I had a list of issues, and I called for a meeting, which had GWA representatives, Teresa Rojas, and let's see, who else was present? Taling Titano, Lester Carlson from BBMR, and Ms. Garcia Tina Garcia from GIDA, and Bond Counsel. So we had a meeting at my office, and I went over certain issues with them. First was the timing of the issuance. Just from a layman's point of view, it seemed to me that, it's a pretty uproarious world we have out there now. A lot of things happening on the international level. I wondered how that might affect the bond issuance. Inflation is high, so now the rates are over 5% for these bond issuances. And even GWA mentioned in its petition the uncertainty in the financial markets, and that interest rates could increase by 200 basis points. So that led me to wonder if maybe there should be more timing on the matter. But Lester Carlson spoke to that issue. He thought actually it is a good time for GWA to go out for the bonds, that the interest rate is pretty much similar to what other government bonds have been at. And he also felt that the fact that the GWA bonds are triple tax exempt meant that it would be an advantageous time. So they're projecting end of July. And he also mentioned that they're expert in bond issuances more than I'm sure. And so they felt that they were able to determine what would be a good time or not. And he also mentioned in some circumstances, if the interest rate was too high, here in the law, the interest rate for the bondholders can't be more than 7%. So Lester indicated, well, if it was around 7%, he might have concerns in Guam. So I think they're taking all the proper matters into consideration. The amount of the bond issuance raised some question in my mind. An amount not to exceed $350 million, but then the underwriters reflecting the bonds as $274 million. I thought, well, what's the reason for the difference? But Ms. Rojas explained, there are uncertainties about the issuance. We may have to go out for more than we thought we would. And then again, I figured, well, the legislature already authorized up to $550 million, so it's hard to disagree with that. So I thought that was adequately explained. And the bond counsel and Mr. Carlson had agreed that they wanted the PUC to approve an amount not to exceed $350 million. The bond total interest cost rate. I mentioned the TIC rate for the issuance was 5.14%. I just remember from prior bond issuances that in the 2020 GWA refunding bonds, which I had covered, the total interest cost was 4.01%. And in 2024, ALJL Contra handled the refunding bonds, which I believe had an estimated total interest cost at around 3.389%. So it seems a little higher now, but again, Mr. Carlson said, well, the other rates the government agencies are getting are around the 5.14%, and he thought that was an acceptable rate at the time being. And then the 5-year interest-only payments. What I wondered is, well, what I've learned about these kinds of things, when you have improvements, you really want the ratepayers that are benefiting the most from the improvements to pay for them. So if they're being built now, the present ratepayers should be paying. But it was also explained to me, the interest payments are fairly negligible in the first 5 years, right? It's mostly principal payments. So it was said the amounts wouldn't be that large and would be within the rate plan figures that they had given. And also I asked bond counsel whether municipal bond issuances included often these provisions for deferral of principal. And he said they did, that was something commonly done. And I asked him and he said 5 years, yeah. That was what he said. That was Mr. Wang from the Oric law firm, who's been handling the bonds for the government for many years.
Because I read someplace, and I can't remember now where, it said that one of the reasons they were going out for 5 years was because they weren't quite sure of the PUC approval on the rates. That's probably exactly where I found that. So that kind of bothered me. They weren't sure that the PUC was going to do it.
Well, yeah. What they said was, the rates, the true up rates will be before the PUC in September. So we're presently looking at the true up of rates, and it's true. I mean, GWA can't say for sure, what those approved rates will be. So I don't know. I think I concluded that they had an explanation, and the underwriters suggested that deferring the principal was a way to ensure that proposed rate increases are sufficient to cover debt service. So they had reasons, and I thought they Also, you may have noticed, there usually, when you've done bond issuances in the past, there's one supplemental bond, supplemental indenture to approve the new bond that's being made. But here, there are two. There's the 11th supplemental, which is kind of the traditional, just talking about this bond issuance and updates. But there's also a 12th supplemental indenture. It's very lengthy. You might have noticed. It includes all the bond indentures. So what it is an update of the 2005 bond indenture. And there are a number of reasons it had to be updated. One is that TECP and the other financing programs weren't really referenced much before. So they've added those into the 12th supplemental indenture. It changes certain provisions of the prior 2005 indenture relating to the calculation of annual debt service, a requirement of bond reserve fund for additional bonds, and a reduction in the amount of bond reserve fund requirement to 50% of the maximum annual debt service for the current or any future year on all outstanding bonds. I think it used to be 100%. I don't know if I'm correct, but they've changed that. And then there's some other technical problems. So one is, since they have a 12th supplemental indenture, the existing bondholders haven't approved that. So before it can be effective against the existing bondholders, they really have to vote on it. And there are transition periods in this 12th supplemental indenture where 60% of the bondholders have to approve the 12th supplemental indenture so that it will be applicable to them. So all in all, I've reviewed the 11th and 12th supplemental indentures. I think they're reasonable. I didn't find anything that disturbs me on them, and I think that you're required actually for a bond issuance to approve the terms and conditions. So that's in one of the orders. Finally, my recommendation, based on the record before the Commission and the independent review by PUC's consultant, Georgetown Consulting Group, the administrative law judge recommends that the PUC approve GWA's petition for issuance and sale of the Guam Waterworks Authority Water and Wastewater Series 2025A revenue bonds. And I always feel, the PUC is a administrative agency. It is bound to some extent, to a great extent, by what the legislature has ordered. And in Public Law 37103, the legislature authorized the bonds, said they were needed, necessary, and it's difficult for an administrative agency to question or overturn legal guidance from the legislature through enacted law. Furthermore, in the orders that you'll see, I'm recommending you do need to approve the form, terms, and conditions contained in the bond documents, all of them, the preliminary statement, the indentures, bond purchase agreement, the disclosure agreement, and also, of course, the 11th and 12th supplemental indentures. The two indentures, supplemental indentures, are in the petition, and they're also attached to the order that you will be asked to approve. And the two orders, it's kind of standard, what you've approved in the past. There are two orders. There's just the order, which indicates that GWA always has to get prior commission approval of projects listed in the order. Now, there are some exceptions here. The commission previously has accepted certain 2011 stipulated order projects from PUC review, and also in terms of the partial consent decree, many of those water and wastewater projects, I believe there's some exclusion, because they need to be done timely. So this only applies to projects that aren't already excluded by the PUC from the contract review protocol. And otherwise, we also ask that when GWA is finished with the bond issuance process, that it provides us with the relevant total interest cost and other aspects of the bond issuance, which they normally do. The other order is the order approving long-term debt, and it goes through a lengthy explanation of every bond issuance since 2005. But I think the important provisions here are, the issuance of bonds. It refers to Exhibit B, and in Exhibit B are the 11th and 12th supplemental indentures. So they are subject to your prior review and approval. So that's a part of the order that those documents be approved. And of course, you would be authorizing the borrowing of the funds described in the indentures in the principal amount not to exceed $350 million. And you would be approving other costs of the issuance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few things to add on to what the ALJ has said. With respect to the all-in TIC, he cited some numbers from our previous issuances which were lower. And I would comment that the market conditions, for example, when we did the last new money issuance, were much more favorable to GWA than they are right now. The interest rates were lower. The other thing is with the 2024 refunding, we had a significant amount of marketing, and you might recall that included both the standard refunding and a tender. So there was a lot of investor presentations which drove up interest, and the underwriters aggressively beat them down on the pricing. So we had a much lower true interest cost, total interest cost at the end of the process than when we first started. We intend to exert the same type of effort for marketing these bonds. We will highlight the triple tax exempt benefit to institutional investors, and we hope that will drive the total interest cost down from what's the projections are right now. So you can be assured that GWA will make its best efforts to try and lower the interest rates. With respect to just a comment with respect to the deferred principal, in prior bond issuances, we have employed a capitalized interest structure in the bonds, and we are not doing it. Our financial advisors, since the last 5-year rate plan, have advised us against structuring our bonds that way. And just for pure comparison, on this issuance, if we were to employ a capitalized interest structure, it would add an additional $36 billion in total debt service. So by not employing that, we are saving money. It does increase the debt service amounts a little bit earlier, which is part of the reason we are using the principal deferment for the 5 years in order to kind of balance that out. But we do believe that we are saving ratepayers money with the bond structure that has been proposed for this transaction.
With the no principal in the first 5 years, do you have any idea how much that matters on a annual basis? Right now, you're structured to pay $18.5 million a year on this bond.
I think it only goes up by about $1 million or so.
Yeah, wouldn't imagine it'd be too much. Just like a house mortgage, the first 5 years, you're not really paying that much.
I mean, mostly interest, yeah.
I just want to ask you a few questions on some of the capital projects. So you're putting up $15 million into Santa Rita. Is that going to be bringing us quite a bit more water up there and helping to reduce possibly some of the Navy purchases when that project is done?
That's exactly the purpose of that project, to expand the capture zone in the springs. We anticipate, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's on the order of 30 to 40% of an increase in flows from the springs that would reduce significantly the amount of water that we purchase from the Navy in the Santa Rita agate area.
And it looks like in the second fiscal year, you're really ramping up, approaching the PFOS and the deals and so forth with 36 million. After the first year is about 9 million.
Right.
Okay. And we're putting over 30 million into the Agani wastewater treatment plant. That's
Just major.
I've been there with you before. That was a few years ago. I can't imagine what it looks like right now.
It's in need of some major equipment rehabilitation.
Yeah. Okay. I don't have any other questions right now, Miguel. But commissioners, do you have any questions regarding this? Joe, do you have some?
Yeah, for the CIP source of funds, fiscal year 28 and 29, you're showing EPA grants dropping from 30 million to 4 million for those 28 and 29. What's the reasoning?
So the larger numbers that you're seeing in the earlier years are amounts that have been previously authorized under the bipartisan infrastructure law. That only has a 5-year life, and so once it runs out, we go back to what the normal distributions would be for the SRF program. When I say normal, I mean normal prior maybe to this administration. This administration has sought to cut EPA funding by about 35%. So we are certain that we are getting both the bill funding and regular SRF funding for fiscal year 26, and that's because we get it at the end of the fiscal year. So EPA has authorized fiscal year 25 funding already. So we're sure we're going to get that, but we won't see it until fiscal year 26. So we know that's coming. But after that, even the numbers that are there now, those are our projections. That's what's authorized under law. But if the administration decides not to fund it, then we may not get that elevated amount for 27.
Anything, Doris? Go ahead.
I have just a few questions. On this is the year to the ninth report. You say you're supposed to do an annual report. Have you done any IROC required annual report?
Sorry, if you could elaborate on which report? There's
B94 requires that you give to the bondholder 278 hours annual report
that's our regular annual financial statements.
nothing more.
No, there are other disclosure requirements that we have to make. The annual report is one of the big ones, but we have made all of the previous disclosure filings, and we have Digital Assurance Corporation, or DAC, who helps us track what we need to submit and helps us to post it.
So this is just more for the education of our commission. Could you provide that report to the bondholders?
Sure.
You mentioned, Craig, you mentioned that going forward, bondholders must reduce by 50%
That would be with, once the springing
yeah.
amendments take place. So when the 60% of the bondholders approve that, then that, it will happen eventually, because we will refund the outstanding bonds that require that 60% approval. And once they refund it, those new provisions will apply, and if they purchase the bonds, then they agree to it.
That was my question. What's going to happen to that 50%? Remember, it's like reserve fund is like 30 million, you all in 15, what's going to happen to the other 15? Pay bonds down, or is it
think that the 50, when we do additional new money issuances, we hope that that 50% of the total debt service in the reserve would apply. And so with each new bond issuance, it adds to the amount in the debt service reserve. So there would be an increase based on whatever we're borrowing in the future. And when the springing amendments come in, that would reduce the total amount based on whatever the total debt service is at the time that the springing amendments become effective, reduce that amount to 50%. And if there is an excess in the reserve, we could keep it in the reserve because that's just the minimum. Or if the indenture allows for us to put it into the construction fund, then it would go into the construction fund and reduce any future borrowings. There's a potential that we could use the cash that we would have already had and reduce the amount that we would have to fund for future borrowings into the debt service reserve.
So one of the things that concerned me was, on the water users or effort quality from college. The number of 65% really kind of caught my eye that, we're losing 65% of the water production. And what concerns me is this is on table 3, page 166, that the projection of the non-revenue currently is projected to go down a little bit in 26, 27, 28, 29. There's very little reduction. And that's a bit, and we've already been talking about the water loss situations for 30 years.
So
my concern is you're projecting in the future very minimal reduction in your non-revenue.
So let me just make some clarifications. The table that you're looking at relates only to our financial projections for what we produce, what we sell and bill, and it's calculating that difference. I just want to make the fine point of distinction that the non-revenue water based on that financial calculation is not the same as the percentage of losses, real losses that we lose through leaks. That number will be lower than the 65% that you're referencing, just as a fine point. But you're correct in your observation that it does not move much. And that is because we don't project, those are financial projections. We're not projecting what we would reduce water losses by through the execution of our water loss control program. So when we actually put these projects, pipe replacement projects in the ground, we haven't made a projection. So let's say the designs are in process now. Typically on a capital improvement program, it's a 3-year execution. If we're lucky, we get the design completed in a year, 2 years to construct. So at the end of the 3 years, the project is completed. We won't see improvements from the installation or replacement of leaky pipes for at least 3 years from the time that we get the funding to start the design. So we are not making any projections on what those reductions in losses will be, but we anticipate that there will be losses. Those are the numbers that you're looking at are just the projections of what we think we are going to, our level of production now, which we've essentially kept the same, what we're billing, which we've essentially kept the same, but projected a little bit more for nominal growth and whatnot. And then the difference between those two numbers is what you're reading as a loss. But that we are hoping will not correspond to the actual reduction in losses that we will see once we put these new pipe replacements in the ground, once we are able to reduce our production rates to match the reduced losses. Those things are not projected, but they will occur as we execute the water loss control program. So those are conservative, and the actual performance should be better.
Well, according to this table, okay, the non-revenue loss was 9.2 million in 2020. And 2029, it's gonna actually be higher, 9.3. So, I'm not sure what you just told me, but I'm just looking at, and again, I understand there's gonna be some things, projections, but you paid a lot of money to some consultants to project this. According to these projections, there are any meaningful reduction. And we're talking here, period 2025, and this program already started at least, 2 years ago, and still no.
Sorry, the program that started 2 years ago with the water loss control program was for the establishment of the DMAs. But after a couple years of that being in place and having 20 or so out of 36 DMAs in place, and the leak detection ongoing, after all those efforts, what we've concluded, and the data supports this from the field, is that the pipe, you can keep fixing the leaks, but you're not going to sustain the reduction in losses unless you replace the pipes because they're beyond their useful service life, which is why we are now in the process of getting this funding so that we can implement those capital replacements.
Well, in effect, it says unless you replace all of the pipes, you're gonna continue these losses. Once you repair one, the leak just keeps on going further down, and finds that way.
Well, we haven't replaced the pipes on a significant scale. That's what we're attempting to do now.
Okay, all right. So how long a project was that was based?
Each project typically takes 3 years to implement, but this will be a ongoing, rolling process until we achieve our targets.
Okay, on the next page, there was something, according to the consultant, the overall condition of the wastewater collection system is poor there.
It's an accurate assessment. This is why we are under partial consent decree with US EPA and Department of Justice. And these bonds are necessary to fund the improvements in order to address the compliance requirements in the partial consent decree.
But on the bright
And, you know-
side, we have some wonderful new wastewater treatment plants.
Well, and we're approaching $1 billion in debt. With this bond issue, it's gonna help us over $1 billion in debt, so.
Where are we total on GWA's debt right now? We got what, 600?
800.
800?
600 in long-term,
670.
in long-term debt only.
In another area, it says that the average annual return of the market value of assets has been 3.2% for the last 5 fiscal years.
So my question to you is, how does that compare? Because 3.2 for 5 years, I don't follow this that closely, but that seems a little bit.
Sorry,
low.
what table are you referring to?
This is on page 184 in the middle. He's just talking about,
I guess these are your investment, the funds you're holding.
it says
Oh, I'm sorry, that's not you. I apologize. That's not you. Okay, that's the retirement. That's a question for the retirement. Okay. Sorry. I thought that was low. Okay,
and then, in one of the,
I think, Fred, you mentioned we'll get all of the final numbers at the end, like especially the sources and application funds. And are you still expected to pay a premium?
Yes.
The copay?
Yes. We'll provide.
Just, I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doris. Rowena?
Yes, I was just wondering, the 12, supplemental. You had mentioned that we had questions about it. And we never seen that before, because we have the 11. This 12 supplemental indenture, is this something different from what we've ever done before with the other?
No, not entirely, because the first indenture was the 2005.
Right.
So that was the one that really, was the first indenture, so it goes through everything. This 12th indenture is really a replacement of the 2005. So
Amendment.
it's not entirely new. I think it's just basically to correct and update many of the provisions of the 2005 indenture.
Okay, so it has to have 60% of the existing bondholders' approval. So this normally goes through. Because they
This
have
is
to make sure they
the-
have that 60%.
This is the first time we have done one, but it's not the first time bond counsel has done one. And the way that it was explained to me is that it only springs into effect when that threshold of 60% of holders of outstanding bonds agree. And that won't happen until we move forward and sell or refund more bonds.
So the sooner we move, hopefully we're going to get the 5% rate instead of going up to the 7%. We're hoping.
We are going to do our best to make sure we are at 5 or if we can below. But if the market conditions are such that that's where we are when we're in pricing, and that would be a pretty catastrophic event between now and then to drive the rates up that high. We don't anticipate getting anywhere near 7%.
Concerned. Okay, thank you.
No questions, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move to approve GWA docket 2508.
Thank you, Pete. Is there a second?
Second.
Joe seconds. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you,
Miguel,
Commissioner.
one more thing, looking out over the horizon, 2027, we're looking at another one at that point in time?
2027, 2028. Commission will recall when we submitted the 5-year plan, we had intended to use short-term alternative
Right.
concession plans.
Yep.
The market conditions since that rate plan was approved, kind of went on their ears, the interest rates, but also the market change for rates not correct. They were inverted previously, so that still has not happened, but we intend to push having that tool in the toolbox. We can use short term, but we're projecting now in 27 might push out, but right now as the time is, we will likely need another issuance in 2027, especially if the short-term revolving line that comes over, whether we might have to take it out.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Miguel. Thanks, Teresa. Next item. GPA docket number 2513, petition of the Guam Power Authority for two-step reduction in the LEAC for the period of August 1, 2025 through January 21st, 2026. We have an ALJ report and a proposed order. Fred?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. So this matter comes before the PUC upon the petition of GPA, which requests that the PUC implement a two-step reduction in the LEAC factor. First, from 20.8802 cents per kilowatt hour to 18.8781 cents per kilowatt hour. And that would be for the period of 1 month, August 1, 2025 through August 31, 2025. Secondly, a further reduction from the 18.8781 cents per kilowatt hour to 13.5840 cents for the period of September 1, 2025 through January 31st, 2026. Effective February 1, 2025, PUC reduced the LEAC factor from 26.1995 per kilowatt hour to 20.8802 for meters read during the 6-month period ending July 31, 2025. So that's the current LEAC factor. The basis for the reduction was a 14% decrease in fuel prices. In GPA Resolution FY 2025-17, dated May 27th of this year, the CCU authorized GPA management to petition the PUC to reduce the current LEAC factor in the two-step process that I've described over the next 6-month period. GPA's rationale for continuing to reduce the LEAC factor for the next 6-month period is that there has been further decreases in fuel prices. The average market price of fuel presented for the current period, the current LEAC period, was at $100.01 per barrel for the current LEAC period. But the projected average price of fuel for the upcoming period is $89.93 per barrel. A second reason offered by GPA for the requested decrease in the LEAC factor is that the Ukadu Power Plant is expected to be operational in September 2025. According to GPA, the Ukadu plant is, quote, a highly efficient combined cycle plant that significantly reduces the amount of fuel required. On June 2nd, I requested that Mariana's consulting group assist the PUC in reviewing the LEAC petition of GPA. And MCG did file their report on June 17th. So in analyzing this, it appears to our consultants, MCG and myself, that the LEAC factor should be set by the PUC for the entire next 6-month period, rather than in the two-step process proposed by GPA. And MCG has outlined the reasons why it believes that this is the case. They approved one LEAC factor for the entire period through January 31, 2026, which would be an overall reduction of 25.53% in the LEAC and 17.4% reduction in the overall bill. In its report, MCG has given the reasons for this. First, it finds that a 6-month rate reduction appears to be more in line with the intent of the LEAC program and is consistent with practice in prior LEAC rate adjustments. If GPA's proposal were accepted, basically over a period of 3 months, and that would be, let's see, July, August, and September, you'd have 3 different LEAC rates, and that's not really consistent with the way the LEAC program works. The overall impact of the 6-month rate adjustment will have essentially the same impact on ratepayers as the two-step approach requested by GPA. I believe that MCG has correctly characterized the history and purpose of the Levelized Energy Adjustment Clause. It was established in part to levelize the impact of anticipated significant future fluctuations in fuel costs and usage on GPA ratepayers. I think for me the important factor is looking at Tariff Z, that is the Levelized Energy Adjustment Clause, the rate schedule that this arises from. And it does contemplate that PUC will set one factor for the entire 6-month period. I attached a copy of Tariff Z, Schedule Z, to the ALJ report. The fuel recovery charge, it refers to one charge, a charge will be calculated semi-annually. In addition, the projected fuel expenses is required to be calculated over the entire 6 months, not for 1 month here and then five months later. And Schedule C states on its face, the fuel recovery charge, again, one charge, will be recalculated semi-annually for a 6-month period and be subject to the approval of the Guam Public Utilities Commission. And by the way, to point out at the beginning, there's always a safety valve. Even if in this case, let's say the LEAC recommended by MCG is too high, that is, GPA recovers more through LEAC than we expect, they can come back to the PUC. They can come back and file a petition if there's a $2 million over recovery to have us adjust it. And that's exactly what we've done in the past. There was a period in February 2020, the LEAC period commencing them over 6 months, where the PUC addressed the LEAC factor on 3 occasions because of steep declines in fuel prices. And there, the PUC had reduced the LEAC factor from about 15.4 cents down to 8.6 cents. But in that case, for each reduction, that's what happened. GPA came in and said, we should reduce it further. So that's the remedy, really, if the LEAC factor is set too high, for example. So also I presented as Exhibit B to the report. This is a summary that was prepared by Mariana's consulting group. Well, I'll talk about that in a minute. One other factor, there was a period too in 2021 where LEAC increased by, I think it was 53% over the period. Now, it was true there, the PUC did set a couple of varying rates, but that was really a much different situation. That was where LEAC was going up precipitously and ratepayers couldn't afford the 53%. So that's not really the situation that we have here at all, because it's possible with one LEAC factor over the 6-month period where the rates are being reduced to benefit the ratepayers for the entire period. It's not a case where they're facing a huge increase, just a different situation. Getting back to Exhibit 2, what MCG did there is compare their rates to those of GPA. And overall, I think there's about a 1 cent difference. I mean, if you looked at GPA's proposal in terms of a 6-month, theirs was maybe 14.5 and MCG's was about 15.5, a 1 cent difference over the LEAC period. The final factor on that is that, as you remember in LEAC, there's 2 steps. GPA files its petition based on the fuel prices when it files. Now, here they filed in May, and the Morgan Stanley results showed a certain fuel price. But we have a rule that a 5-day average, 10 days before this meeting, has to be submitted by GPA, and they did that in this case. And basically, the updated fuel prices showed a pretty substantial increase from when GPA filed its petition. So on June 26th, actually is the most recent Morgan Stanley report I've looked at. The cost per barrel of Singapore 10 parts per million was $87 per barrel, but when GPA filed its petition in May, it was $77. So, $10 increase. my point is, that's why it's probably the wise move to reduce the amount, yeah, to not reduce it so much to provide for this increase in fuel prices. Now, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. It's true that in the most recent Morgan Stanley period, the prices went up. After that, they kind of went down a little bit again and then up. So they're very volatile. But still, the fact is that they're higher now than they were when GPA filed. And just to be cautious, I think it shouldn't be set too low. It can always be readjusted later if that's warranted under the circumstances. And MCG did indicate some of the problems we have, the issues in the Middle East. They had continued, as I said, after things were resolved a little bit, they changed some. But still, those tensions are there, so we don't know what's going to happen. There could be a further impact on the fuel prices. Based upon the increased MS fuel pricing for June 9 through June 16, MCG recommends that the LEAC factor for the next 6 months be set at 15.5495 cents per kilowatt hour. And as I mentioned, that's only roughly 1 cent more than GPA's equivalent factor would be for the 6-month period. And again, finally, there's the fail-safe mechanism of tariff Z if for some reason it hasn't been reduced enough to date. The LEAC factor hasn't been reduced. So I'm recommending, for the reasons stated in the report and tonight, that PUC adopt the position of Mariana's Consulting Group and reduce the LEAC factor from 20.8802 cents per kilowatt hour down to 15.5495 cents for meters read on and after August 1, 2025 and through January 31, 2026. And I've prepared an order for your approval, which sets that secondary fuel recovery factor and also the other fuel factor levels for secondary, primary, and transmission levels. And as I had mentioned, it will be a 25.53% decrease in the LEAC factor for a residential customer utilizing the average of 1,000 kilowatt hours per month and a 17.40% decrease in the total bill.
John, comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Commissioners. GPA supports the recommendation. As we all understand, this is a revenue neutral situation. GPA was just thinking out of the box, if you will, because this is a very unusual circumstances. We never put in a new power plant in since 1999. So as we all understand, there is a base rate file, and so we were hoping that we don't have to, it's more a transitional lower. But be it as it may, it is a happy issue for everyone. It is a reduction, a continued reduction of energy costs to our ratepayers, and more importantly, it's going to be more on a sustained basis because, again, the Okudu power plant provides us energy costs, a very efficient machine. So in the impact that we have all gone through, where we've gone up to 42 cents a kilowatt hour, is not the situation that we're going to be in after Okudu comes on the line. I've calculated that 42 cents will be at around the 31 cents. So that's a huge difference. So we do support the recommendation. Yes, fuel prices has jumped somewhat and can kind of coming down again. But again, we'll make it all revenue neutral in the January time frame. Even our plan with Okudu has hit a glitch. the combined cycle steam turbine has some issues, and they're trying to address it now. So we're not into the combined cycle stage yet. So all of this will come into play, and hopefully they're still working to commission that plan by September 30 and stuff. But that being all said, I think we support the recommendation.
Thank you, John. Any questions from the commissioners? Go ahead. Oh, go ahead, Doris.
comment or observation. It's been 6 years since we were that low in August of 2019. So I think that would be a welcome for each for rate meetings.
Go ahead, Pete.
John, just a quick update on the under recovery or the over recovery. Since we're reducing the LEAC, where are we now with that? Also, we're that whole 10, 14, 18 million is gone, and we're now a little bit positive. Okay.
That's a huge from the 47 million that we have been. I think very successful program.
Awesome. I know you said you were going to do it on your watch, and you did it. So, is there after January? Is there are you projecting another decrease?
It really all depends on the fuel prices, no? But I think with Pokudu comes on the line in September or so, I think like Fred had noted, the recommendations a little more conservative than we were. And so if prices don't go up and it comes on the line in September, then
We can get it closer
they
to the
could be
13 cents.
close to. But again, we can expect the LEAC in January to reflect the next 6 months, which is how we're going to operate, which is most likely. And again, we have to get used to operating the 198 versus all the other machines that we have. So what we're looking at that now is a combination of Ukudu and PP8 and 9, because they're the two most efficient machine. Case in point, Ukudu will give us about 20 kilowatt hours per gallon. MEC8 and 9 is about 15 and a half kilowatts hours. Then if we go down further than that, you're down to 11. And so just managing, operating, and all of that now will be the next phase that will come in for the next LEAC period. That's
Right.
good one.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I just noticed in the petition and also in the CCU resolution, there's this statement that GPA did not include costs associated with the demand side management rebate program for the LEAC period from February 2025 to July 2025. Just explain the significance of that, why that statement is in.
I believe John K will correct me if I'm wrong. Is that we still have funds from the previous LEAC, because whatever we receive for the rebate stays in the fund. So I think we still have enough to keep on covering the demand side management program. So we didn't have to include that rate to generate the 1.5 million per year for rebates. But that has been a very successful program for everyone. Thank you, PUC and CCU and everyone. Remember, we've always said two things that would reduce the cost for the consumer. One is the rates that we provide to GPA and fuel and stuff, but the second is their consumption. And even it works even for the new customers. They're buying efficient machines now. Hardly anyone is buying the inefficient one. And again, the vendors are bringing in higher and higher series. And so, but I think where we at though is that we reduced one was very inefficient, if you will. But I think most of the customers are efficient now. So what we're trying to see is now growth, no? Real growth, not just from hot weather and all of that, it's real growth. I think it's starting to come. So that's the way I see it.
Okay, thank
And
you.
I was just gonna add, I think we've been made that statement in the last few petitions. I seem to recall we included that.
Okay, appreciate that.
I think
That-
we
that
we
program-
rebate about 100-some thousand a month. That's
Yeah, that's good. So, Mr. Chairman, I would move to approve the ALJ's proposed order adopting the recommendation of MCG as to the adjustment of the LEAC.
Thank you, Mike. Second?
Second.
Joe seconds. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. 25%, actually. Say the healthy will not die in August. I thought the 13 cents is gonna.
And real quick here, GPA docket number 2515, petition of GPA to approve its procurement of energy storage system, energy shifting and grid services. Is this one tabled for this evening, Joe Pat? Yes. Okay. Will it be ready next month?
No meeting next month.
Oh, no meeting next month, so the August meeting it will be ready. Okay. Is it time sensitive at all, John? Or you can wait? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, John. Thank you, Mary. Next, we're into administrative matters, update on solicitation of lease for office space. Anthony, what's the latest?
Well, Mr. Chair, I've included the actual draft RFQ for office space. This is in accordance with our new procurement guidelines. And that's an item number 6. So basically, this was based off of predominantly the Chamorro Land Trust Commission's recent solicitation for office space, but they were looking for 5,000 square meters of space. Of course, our existing office space is only like 987 square meters. I did add 1,500 meters as the minimum amount of office space, because that would give kind of our existing space with enough space for our own conference room internal. So,
You mean 1,500 feet, square feet? Otherwise, yeah.
square feet, apologize, yeah, no, square meters would be far larger, so, okay, so square feet, sorry. But, and I would like the PUC to note that on page 1 of the draft lease, it does have the language in the specifications that if the building is multi-story, then the office space offered shall have an operational elevator or escalator from the ground floor to the floor in which the space offered, or in which the office space is located. And the lease shall state that if the elevator or escalator becomes non-operational during the term of the lease for any reason, for a period exceeding 14 days, the PUC shall have a unilateral right to terminate the lease. So that language will be present just to avoid our current situation. Other than that, pretty much the RFQ's general specifications would give the PUC at least 5 parking stalls, would allow the PUC to put up building signage, very similar to what we have today. And also, the lease would require the building to have a backup generator. It would be for a term of 5 years, and there is a draft contract that's attached to the lease as well. So if the PUC were to approve this, then we could issue the RFQ. We've already identified 1 potential vendor to send this to, excuse me, 2 potential vendors to send this to. We're still looking for a 3rd, and we could likely, if we could get this awarded, of course, it's a move-in date of 60 days after award. Let's just move out of our current location into the new location.
Very good. Thank you, Anthony.
We would have to procure a separate contract for this is just the lease for office, space.
Never hurts to ask.
Although you're much smaller. It's still gonna. I'm just
I
guessing.
don't know if it'd be that.
Approximately five, actually, office that size, well, it did cost, just by way of reference, my office space on the 8th floor, this is when the elevators were still functional though. It did cost about 6,000 to move all that stuff out, but there were a lot of files, there was a lot of, furniture, so on and so forth, even though I got rid of most of it,
Fortunately, it's on the second floor, but still, that's a lot of.
1,500 square feet. Current location has 987 square feet.
So did, APC issue a security deposit to GCC?
I did not find any evidence of one. I'd have to double check for that.
That's before all of them.
It might very well be, way back.
use that for the movie cost.
Yeah. But I could, if you wanted to, I could, amend this, by adding, the cost of move, that would be paid by the new landlord or?
Well, we never moved, so we never had to exercise that issue. But
It'd be a bit much to ask probably if it's gonna be in the 5 or 6 grand.
Yeah, I would say that's a rare clause. I've never seen that, except in the OPA lease. At your request. You're the, public auditor.
Is there a,
there was actually more with this area. You know, because, if you don't factor in the cost of moving, that does add to the overall rent.
if it's the true cost?
That was just an observation.
So
So
how,
this, conference room, office, is it, could it be something like this?
Yeah.
If people have offices here, we have separate conference room.
Well, the RFQ doesn't specifically state that it's one contiguous office space. So, the answer to your question would be yes, it would be, but we would be paying rent for our own conference room. It wouldn't necessarily, be adjacent to the space. Ideally though, it would be in the same space.
So that area is within the office facilities.
No, we're asking for 1,500, okay? But, yeah, one potential vendor does have a space, I believe, 1,800 square feet.
So in your
Yep.
in your local area that we're in Cleveland, you said that they run this Cat 6 5 of those in your office. In the event that it is a separate conference room, can you have them run it as a Cat 5 into the conference room? So that we can screen and have the community?
That's if it's, if it's not contiguous office space?
Correct.
Okay, I could put that language in there.
how do you determine who you send it to? Is there a, I mean, is it just, like if one of the commissioners has companies that we're aware of that might be interested, is it appropriate for us to just give you the information to send it to?
Probably not.
So how would we, how do you determine if, like who you're gonna send it to, I guess?
Well, so, it's just with the specifications, which, and it's within, it's within a certain geographic area. So let's start with office, the amount of office space, 1,500 square feet. What vendors could potentially provide that? Likewise, they have to be in the Agana, Tamuning, Tumon, Maragata, Manila. basically the central corridor area. So there's a geographical requirement there. They'd have to have a backup generator. Okay, so we'd be looking for vendors who could potentially meet the specifications. It doesn't have to now at least 3. It doesn't have to be 3. We could send it out to 5.
We're not gonna publish.
No, no. We would submit these, and then the lowest quote that meets the specifications would win.
So no publishing.
No. That would be, if we were following Guam procurement law, that would be correct.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's appropriate or not, it's just small items that kind of, everybody knows some of the event that we want to get, you just tell them that it would, right? So that maybe put a close to it.
Well, we would, basically, the way this would work is we would issue it to the potential vendors, ask them to submit a quote by a deadline. It's blank here, because we don't know what date we're going to issue this. And basically, they would submit by that date if they're going to submit a quote. And it's not unusual to get a no quote or no response by certain vendors.
What about putting the RFQ on our website, just for,
Good, yeah, that's fine.
transparency?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good idea.
You know, with this little thing, fashion, PUC, looking for space, click here, interested.
Yeah.
Well, then we'd open it up to a broader number of people, but at the same time, once again, we have the,
Would have to be within a certain village.
well, yeah, and then once again, the broader market would, or if you're opening this up to the broader market, more likely it might be that there'd be potentially protests or something. That's correct. Well, following our guidelines would be a very expedited protest, but there is a potential they could file a lawsuit as well.
Loss based on, I think, 3 people qualified completely and 3 couldn't come. The other 2 say, it's a reason for protest.
Well, the general reason for a protest is either the government really messed up, or the average protester will game the system by trying to delay procurement, just like in the GPA printing case. Especially if they're the existing vendor. And we do have that situation right now where we are paying rent to an existing vendor.
But we're trying to get these.
That's correct. I think they would let us, yeah. I think they've already expressly let us go.
And then you also have an expedited process for protest.
That's correct.
Okay.
Because
I would just offer you, why don't you?
because, okay,
I'm not saying why can't you, why don't you?
the process is, we, currently in our guidelines, it is to just simply send the request for quotation out to at least 3 vendors for office space. That's what it says. And that's what we'd have to follow. Now, if we had kept, or basically, if it's over, I think, $150,000, then generally, office space was an exception to that, but generally, that's where we would have to put that out or publicize that particular solicitation.
Decided what 3 was going to.
You could,
Yeah, we decided.
and it doesn't have to be 3, it's just at least 3. Yeah. So already we're looking at Citibank, the DNA building, and that's as far as we got in terms of potential vendors that could satisfy the space requirements.
The old city vendor. Actually got a very nice, unit there.
Oh, is that still
That's how you know where it's
It's
at.
just like, it's down the road from cinema.
They just reopened. Okay.
If we cancel it in the fall.
We could. Okay.
That's
So,
negotiable.
I will amend the draft lease and RFQ accordingly. Now that's, just so I understand, so if the lease is terminated by the PUC for cause, it's the landlord who's awarded the lease that would pay the moving costs of the location.
Okay. Okay. We've already been speaking with them, so I think they're letting,
5 spaces. That's correct.
no, no.
Well, we can't, okay, and you're talking a lot more for a lease for spaces that would come at a cost. 5 would be for PUC staff, administration, or if we're expecting dignitaries or what have you, we would just have 5 spaces. I don't know if we have any, I don't think we have any, do we have dedicated spaces now, GCIC? We have 0. 500 square feet would be for a conference room out of that 1,500. Yeah. About a third.
Are we gonna absorb the renovation costs?
That would be correct. That's normally not part of the lease.
So in addition to moving it, renovation costs.
Or the other way I've seen it is the landlord would pay for the cost of renovation, but add that to the lease and be paid off in installments over time. That's the other way. I've seen that. Yeah. So I have the one moving expense. The answer to your question about is there mutual termination of the lease? The answer is no. There's termination for default. And that's either by us or the landlord. Unless you wanted that language in there as well. I could add that in there if that's the desire of the commission. That could be another amendment. But at this, well, it also depends on the area. So for example, the issue with street level is security. You're more prone to break-in at the street level versus the higher levels. But that's, it depends on where this is. But actually, I shouldn't say it doesn't matter where you are along the rising crime rate. So you're always prone to that risk, but it is less the higher up the building. And the other issue you have with this, just as when Fred and I had our office on the first floor, back again, long ago, if there's a typhoon, even if you have shutters, and even if your building is a little, you have to come up some steps. I forget how much water we had, but I think it was that much. And we were like off Skinner Plaza, We thought the boat basin would save us, but not even that saved us. It was Typhoon Paka. And Pungsong.
Yes. There's been some water issues with leaking. Yeah, and air conditioning. That's okay for me. It's been all right, but some of the tenants aren't happy.
Yes. Yeah, if you approve it as amended with the moving costs amendment.
Move to approve, subject to our amendments.
I have all these many years, and in the years to come, I will do the same.
I'm cutting back, yes. I have many obligations, even other than my law office. And so I'm thinking, my present contract goes through March 2026. And I will work till then. And I guess even after that, I could be available, but probably just more limited advice, or somebody wants to know about a matter I handled or something like that. But I think as far as, working the level I have been for the last 17 plus years, probably. will slowly wind down my law office. And I have a realty office, and I have an environmental company that I am. So those will all be in the process of winding down, but likely will take years. But I have to start cutting some things down. And that's kind of how this came up, speaking with the chairman. And we're thinking about, what would be done. I mean, I have had a pretty heavy workload here for the past 17 years. So the question is, how do we move ahead? I mean, there are obviously different ways you could do it. You could just hire another ALJ, that's one. But thinking about it, I mean, the work of the commission really, I think has increased a lot. And I was thinking about it. Right now, we have 3 pending rate cases. Joe Fett's handling the board. I'm handling GPA and GSWA. We have the true up for Waterworks. And with Waterworks, even when we don't have a rate case, we have a true up, which turns out to be like a rate case. So the point is, I think, the commission needs somebody that can devote a lot of time to this position. I think with myself, early years, it was at least 50% of my time and maybe more. Could be a little less than that now. But so you need an attorney that has a fair amount of time to devote to the PUC. And that's why I thought about in-house counsel. Now I don't know who's out there and what the prospects will be. I mean, one problem is there's kind of a limited pool of attorneys that have utilities experience. We had a few in the past. We had Bill Blair, we have Graham Botha. But as far as attorneys that have really spent much time on it, not much. But I think with an in-house counsel, the good thing would be they could devote sufficient time. And if we find somebody that's appropriate, I could certainly, in the time that I would have remaining, help them, to impart whatever knowledge I've gained over the last years. So and there also could be a cost factor. Now, it's true with in-house, you got to pay a set salary. And under our procurement rules that Anthony drafted, actually, we don't find that out until after the most qualified person is selected. And it's only at that point that you negotiate. But my best guess, you'd probably be talking 150,000, something in that range, and maybe something more for the fact that we don't have retirement, we don't have insurance, like we've done with Lou's position and some of the others, to add a factor in. But that's just kind of a guess on my part. But so that's what led to this, asking the commission to consider this resolution authorizing the in-house counsel. I mean, I think clearly you have the authority. Our statutory framework is pretty broad. It allows the commission to retain any professional services required. Now, Anthony is the statutory attorney. We have that, and we have 2 ALJs. But in other words, we've always had more than just one attorney, or we've had multiple attorneys. So, and the law also allows the PUC to employ administrative staff and personnel. So, I mean, the way I view this position, it would assist our staff with in-house tasks. And now, since we have 3 employees, where it only used to be Lou and myself for 7 years, but that attorney could also help just with the routine matters and looking at minutes and preparing agendas and the kind of things an in-house counsel might do. They could also help more kind of with the administration, and another task that I've performed over the years, although not so much lately, but I was asked to be the public information officer. And I have generally been the one, whenever somebody speaks with the media, I've often been the one they call, and it used to be there's certain ones that would call me after every meeting. That's kind of fallen out. But in other words, there are a lot of just kind of general things that maybe fall outside of the normal regulatory dockets that need to be done. I mean, from time to time, we get complaints, from either individuals or, solar companies or different ones that usually involve kind of a separate treatment. So there's certainly a lot of things an in-house counsel could do. And aside from the normal things, I mean, I think 3 attorneys at least are good for the commission because there's enough work that, with all the regulatory requests that we get, that, you really need an additional attorney. And my theory is you need an attorney that could really devote quite a bit of time. So this resolution would authorize the procurement of the in-house counsel, and that would be conducted according to the PUC's procurement guidelines and procedures that Anthony had drafted and were approved by the PUC. Under those rules, it says basically that it's the PUC administrator that conducts the solicitation. And I'm thinking here, I mean, we have a provision for professional services between $1 and $2.50. It would certainly have to fall within that. Should be substantially less than $2.50. But, and the rules also provided that I would serve as a resource in providing advice on proposals, bids. So I'm willing to do that. I prepared a position description. It was just basically my taking into account previous RFPs we've done and things that our council generally do, providing advice or reports on regulatory matters, contract review, the same general things, but also working with the staff on kind of in-house matters. And so that would be something different than we usually cover at present. All the different reports we do, public hearings, hearings at the legislature is another one. I think pretty much I've been the one exclusively doing that. But there's a lot of bills that come up that have to be addressed. I mean, and they're quite serious, So one thing I always do every day in the morning, I look through, I'm on all the government notice lists about from the legislature, what bills are being heard. Because unless we have someone, reviewing, we could miss something. Like there's the, crazy one lately on solar rates. And, all the time we're getting these bills about solar that really affect us. And some that would, remember Senator Richel had some that would have destroyed us. And so my point is that's something that needs to be done and looked after on an ongoing basis. And I think an in-house counsel would be good for that. So those are the main things I've identified, and I think it would be a good way to approve. I like the idea too that I would have time, before I'm leaving to help such person understand the tasks, know what they are, ask any questions. I could provide a copy of all my files that we've done on the matter, and that's why I'm suggesting this.
The concern I have with in-house counsel is, as opposed to like a similar arrangement, like what you are, in other words, practicing attorney who has other clients.
Yes.
But where you were saying that the PUC would be like his largest client, right, where he has to go to work.
Only client.
Yeah, but lead wherever.
That's correct.
Yeah, and it's the most exclusively as opposed to like you, sole practitioner or, and you would devote 50% of his practice
Yes.
time, but he still has others who,
That's correct.
and that, that's my only issue.
Let me say, Harry Birdsall, of course, who was the administrative law judge, did not have any outside clients.
And he was in,
He was in-house.
he gave him a practice.
I think he was paid a monthly salary.
Yes, he was.
Right. So he was kind of like an in-house counsel. But in his time, he was the only counsel. And Georgetown was the only consultant. So they basically did all the consulting.
Both of them come out every 3 months, they weren't the same meeting. And they would stay out here for about 2 weeks. There were a lot of deferred dockets out of work on handling and timing that. It wasn't as busy a situation as it is now. Fred, I know he has other work and everything, but Fred is very, as we all know, a very unique person. And he is essentially been operating almost as an in-house counsel.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
For many
In
years.
effect, he has been.
Yeah,
In
because
effect.
he knows his business and he's fairly efficient at it, and he's very committed to getting the book of business done in a timely manner. And he pushes out a lot of work for the DAC for many, many years. And he essentially has been. And many of these other items, like what he was saying earlier, we know so many times now, there's certain senators at certain times who want to push a bill forward that directly involves us, and they do not inform us about it. They push it forward, right, and we find out because Fred is on top of it, watching this stuff, and sometimes we only have 24 to 48 hours to react and get testimony into the floor for that specific bill.
Well, we'll find out. I have over the years, I've had a few people contact me now and then.
It's possible that we might not have.
We might not.
In-house,
Yeah.
somebody to go through.
I don't know. It's possible.
That's what I was saying, to give us the choice, because the only thing I think is maybe a young lawyer straight out of law school who might be interested.
Local experience, until
Yeah. And that's where I was thinking, where do we have the most likelihood of probabilities? Right
Is
now.
there any interest in one of the 2 document programs?
get to sign orders